Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the next in our series of virtual events hosted by Irwin Mitchell. My name is Vicky Brackett, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer for our Business Legal Services division. And I'm absolutely delighted this morning to host a session of great panellists. Daryn Park, who's an economist at the Centre for Economics and Business Research, CEBR, and he's been working with us on our latest Powerhouse Report, looking specifically at the economic impact of COVID-19. And Jim Hubbard, who is Head of Regional Policy at the CBI. It's great to have them both with us, and hopefully we'll get a lot of insight from them during the course of this session. Would encourage you to ask questions throughout. There is an ability on the system, on the Q&A function, to ask questions, so post those through. And subject to time, we will try and take as many of those as we can as we go through. So the purpose of today's webinar is really just to have a discussion with two people who are probably immersing themselves in this COVID impact day in, day out, and about the current economic picture. I think perhaps more positively, the pathway to recovery, because obviously we've all lived now for 2 or 3 months in that feeling of unreality and a real new normal that is emerging. We're all anxious to get to that road to recovery, so we'll try and explore some of that. Discussion's going to look at some of the findings from our latest economic report, which we can make available to those who haven't seen it, what the government should be looking at doing to stage a sustainable recovery, and finally touch on building back better, understanding how, when faced with the huge challenge that we've had through this pandemic, whether we can actually use that as an opportunity to change our economy for the better. I'm sure everyone will have a view on that. As I said before, Irwin Mitchell has worked with CEBR for over 4 years and partnered with the CBI in 2016 on its Unlocking Regional Growth campaign, which looked at some of the major drivers for improving profitability in the UK. So I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today, and I'm going to let Daryn and Jim introduce themselves one by one. And then we'll go on to a session with Daryn first of all, to talk about the Powerhouse Report and the economic impact. So Daryn, if I can ask you to introduce yourself, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you for having me on. I'm Daryn Park, an economist at the Centre for Economics and Business Research. I was one of the key authors behind the Powerhouse research looking at the coronavirus's impact throughout the UK region. The Centre for Economics Business Research, we do a lot of economic modelling and policy work, as well as working with businesses in terms of estimating footprints, as well as producing macroeconomic forecasts.
Thank you, Daryn. Jim?
Good morning. Yeah, thank you, Vicky and Daryn. So Jim Hubbard, Head of Regional Policy at the CBI. So I lead the CBI's regional policy team based across England with policy colleagues in the devolved nations as well, and we work with leaders across central government, mayoral combined authorities, and local enterprise partnerships in setting out the business view representing the 190,000 businesses made up of all sectors and sizes across the UK.
That's great. Thank you very much, Jim. And thanks for those introductions. If I can, Daryn, if we can perhaps just start the conversation and just turning to the Powerhouse Report. It'd be really helpful, I think, just to set off, just to give some context to those who haven't seen it, and equally just to remind those who have seen it, just really what the purpose of the report was, what we actually set out to discover when we sat down to plan that and work through it.
So the Powerhouse Report looked at how the lockdown was affecting the UK, but importantly, it was looking at how the lockdown was affecting the different regions throughout the UK. So we did this by breaking England down into its classical 9 regions, so London, the South West, South East, Midlands, North East, North West, etc., as well as looking at Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland independently. The way in which this was done was looking at the 105 sectors of the economy and estimating for each one how the lockdown was affecting it. So how demand was being affected by the change in the lockdown, as in people can't go out and buy things from shops, as well as the supply, given the fact that people can't go to work and supply chains were disrupted. The interesting thing about this was the fact that the lockdown wasn't unanimous across the 4 nations. For example, England allowed construction to remain working through the lockdown period, whereas in Scotland it was completely shut off. So it was these nuances that we included within the analysis to try and bring out how the lockdown was affecting each of the different regions independently.
Thank you. And I think, it was staggering for me. I mean, the numbers are staggering, and we were talking just before we came on, weren't we, about the fact that, you did it on a daily basis, the impact on a daily basis, just because it was changing so rapidly. But I think at the time of publication, UK, that as a total UK, the gross added value was down by 34%, which was 2.7 billion a day. So this is putting an enormous strain, as we all know, on the UK economy. But I think we've always done that kind of, when we've done the Powerhouse Report in pre-COVID, we've always looked at that regional impact and how the different regions are responding to different effects. I mean, we did a Brexit one previously, and how that is affecting the country. From a COVID point of view, you mentioned we're seeing the different impacts. What areas of the UK are worst affected, and perhaps why? What areas from your research have probably been the most resilient?
So, I mean, the way this has actually kind of hit the UK is along the north-south divide, which is seen throughout many different areas of the economy. For example, London has the greatest absolute value loss at about £575 million per day. However, this actually has the smallest relative loss, with only losing about 28% of its output per day. In contrast, the Midland areas are the worst affected, with the East Midlands losing 40% of their output per day, and the West Midlands at 39% a day. Of the four regions, the Northern Ireland was the worst affected as well, losing about 38% a day compared to the UK average at about 34%. The reason for this comes down to industry concentrations. London is a local economy which thrives on the service industry. Services industry has been quite resilient in the lockdown period, purely for the fact that most of it can be done from home. People can take their laptops home and continue with working with clients and so on. So their output hasn't been too largely affected. It may be the case that there might be some more absences from sick leave or so on, but for most part, the output has remained fairly resilient. Whereas manufacturing has taken the biggest hit. The reason for this is twofold. The first is the fact that people aren't going out and buying things. There's no demand for final goods anymore. Non-essential retail has virtually collapsed during the lockdown period. All this means that the actual demand for producing these goods to go to the stores falls away. However, there's also the second reason as well, is the fact that these factories can't maintain the social distancing orders put in place. It's virtually impossible to make sure that people work 2 meters apart at all time and have cleanly hands, keeping washing and all that, which implicitly means these factories have to completely shut down. Why this is so important is when you have regions which are so reliant on the manufacturing industry. This is why the Midlands, the East and West Midlands, which rely on car manufacturing and general manufacturing so much, have felt such a brunt of this lockdown period. The fact that these economies rely so heavily on single areas of industry is a massive factor into the lockdown having this diverse effect through the UK. Areas more like Manchester, for example, although it's quite a metropolitan area, it has services in the Manchester city itself, but the rural area throughout the rest of the region means that it feels quite a hard burden when most people can't work from home.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I think so. I think from that, what we're saying is obviously there's an enormous correlation with industry, which is unsurprising. I think in the report you very succinctly gave 4 factors which have affected output, which you touched on there, that ability to work remotely. So can this business transpose itself to a working from home environment? And obviously, as you say, the financial services and professions are much more suitable to do that. And we certainly, Irwin Mitchell, whilst I won't pretend it was an easy first couple of weeks, got most of our workforce working remotely relatively quickly. Proportion of workers off sick you touched on, so I suspect there've been more people unwell than the normal, and that has affected the workforce. Demand you talked about, and also the supply chain disruption, and I think all of those have come together. And as you say, when social distancing doesn't actually allow particular industry to open, that's when the manufacturing and the retail and hospitality all start to suffer. I was interested to see there's still a north-south divide, but what was interesting on that for me was, I think in the report it says the northern homes actually have likely to have more space to find the working space to set up the home office, which was an interesting stat from my perspective. And I think certainly feedback we've had from our own clients, particularly in the hospitality and manufacturing sectors, it's very consistent with what you've found. Touched on this just a little bit earlier, Daryn, when we were speaking. The report was published a month ago. You did that on a daily basis figure because it was changing so quickly. Have you seen anything that's sort of backed up some of the findings that you had and you reported? Has anything altered your view in terms of things we're seeing? What's your view on all of that?
So, I mean, yeah, that's precisely the reason why we did it on a daily basis. The idea of doing a weekly or a monthly impact seemed almost illogical, given the fact that it was, at that time, lockdown rules were changing on a daily basis with each of the new updates. I guess for that reason, you could look at this report that we've done as maybe the impact of the lockdown under the most draconian measures, as opposed to the lockdown now. Given how lockdown has been eased over the past month, I mean, retail is starting to ease open, schools are going back, and so on. The numbers now probably overstate the impact compared to what is actually happening on a daily basis. But in terms of what you were saying, have I seen anything that's backing it up? One of the key areas you could say that really has shown to be shut down is the airline industry. Reports are showing how British Airways, Virgin Atlantic, and so on are all basically filing for massive redundancies and hoping for government bailouts because their industry has virtually collapsed. This is in line with what we were predicting at the time.
And I think, I mean, you know, obviously we've all tracked the news and seen the sort of catastrophic impact on the airline industry, which of course is very widespread, and particularly, I live really close to Gatwick Airport. You know, you can the impact of that is palpable. You know, the number of jobs that will disappear as a result. And I think it's interesting, you know, because this is so crippling for the economy. You can see the government kind of desperately trying to find solutions, and we've had all this recent, you know, potential to go abroad over the summer, and you know, resorts opening up and some of us not being allowed to be there, and you can see that real attempt to revitalise it. But I just wonder whether, you know, that's really going to struggle the whole way through this summer. I'm certainly not that keen on jumping on a plane, I have to say, to the summer holiday, even though getting away from the house would be quite nice. Just switching tack slightly, Daryn, the report obviously looked at that, as you've said, that sort of regional analysis by industry. I think the results are probably not that surprising. They're tracking what the news stories are telling us. You also look, you know, at these trends of working from home. This is a new normal for all of us. We've all had to adapt. Seen the insides of many people's homes over the last 9 weeks. What do you want to just give us could you give us a quick summary on the key findings on that working from home analysis that you did?
Yeah, again, kind of like with the industry impact, it again falls kind of to a north-south divide. So the most recent data we had on this, which we use in the report, was the proportion of people working from home prior to the lockdown. What that found was that in all respects, the proportion of people working from home was relatively low compared to what I imagine it will be post-lockdown. However, the southeast had the greatest share of their workforce working at home at 7% of the entire labour force. This is over double what was seen in the north, with the smallest region being the northeast, with only 3% of their workforce working from home. This is quite significant given the fact that I imagine working from home, again, falls within the ability to do so. The people in the southeast are, again, likely commuters within London working within the service industry, so they have the ability to work from home. Whereas the northeast, northwest, and the Midlands, again, which all seem to be on the lower end of the proportion working from home, they less so to do so. However, a very interesting stat that's also come out of this is that since 2014, the East Midlands has also had the smallest share, percentage growth in working from home shares, whereas all other regions throughout the UK have actually had relatively high growth. Obviously, this is relative to a low base, but it is showing that working from home is becoming more and more popular. And I imagine post-lockdown, it's going to only accelerate it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the working from home is fascinating. I was interested to see those stats. I was actually quite surprised that only 7% of the workforce in the southeast was working from home pre-COVID. It was a very small portion. Obviously, that's changed monumentally overnight. But certainly, we've been surveying our own colleagues, and I'm sure businesses across the country are doing that on what has been the benefits of this, but what has not been, in just to try and identify those opportunities. And there is a real sentiment of whilst there've been some real negatives, and we can perhaps talk about those later, that people have had that sense of being at home, having more family time, cutting the commute time. Productivity's gone up in some areas because people are working a bit longer, and I'm not saying that that's necessarily a good thing. Well-being's a real balance to counter against all of that, but I think we won't return to how it was before, and nor should we. I think we've got to grasp all those good things that have come out of it, but it will be an adaptation by every business as to how it encompasses that. And certainly a challenge for us that we're talking about actively is how do we capture the good stuff and bring everyone back in a new way, so that we don't just all fall back into the normal, well, that is my old desk and that's where I used to sit and that's how I used to do things. And I think that will be a challenge for employers going forward, and making those businesses who are able to embrace change and make the most of that will do very well. The last question, just from me, before we look at some questions that we've got from attendees, is just, we talked, the government have this levelling up agenda about the prosperity across the country. That was a big agenda item for them. I mean, obviously Rishi Sunak's had a few other things on his plate at the moment, but what impact do you think coronavirus is having or will have, if any, on that levelling up agenda, Daryn?
So I think, again, this is kind of twofold. The levelling up agenda is obviously trying to bring all the regions to a more equal playing field in terms of their economic output. One of the clear things that we found in this report is that there has been this massive north-south divide in terms of areas affected. So it really highlights the fact that this levelling up agenda is, if anything, more important post-COVID. However, the other side of the coin to this is the spending that's come in from during the lockdown period has been monumental. The levelling up agenda requires significant investment by the government in research and development skills in all these areas that may be lacking. This is a lot of spending that, frankly, the government may or may not have post-lockdown, as they're trying to ease the spending away from the furlough scheme and all the government or the business helping. So it's an interesting point, because I mean it does highlight the discrepancy between the regions, but it's whether the availability of the funds is still there post-COVID.
Yeah, and I think that's when he starts to balance his books, the old chancellor, and we just look at this in the round, as you rightly say, where is that investment going to come from, because the economy recovery is just going to be so enormous, isn't it? So it'll be interesting to see how they do balance that. But thank you for the insight on all of that. We're going to move on just to give an opportunity for questions that have come in from some of the people on the event. So thank you for that. First one, Daryn, that we've had a few pre the event as well. How many people do you think are considering actually changing, going back to the smart working, changing their work patterns post-COVID? My supposition, which I've just shared, is I think more and more people will work from home. Whether they do that permanently and forever and for all times, I don't know. But do you think that there will be more working from home?
I definitely do. It's like I said before, there's been a general shift towards working from home prior to COVID in the last few years anyway. We ran a survey in April and found that of the entire survey, 27% of people that weren't already working from home were planning to do so partially post-COVID, which shows there's definitely a demand for it once this all returns back to normal. I do think the way in the technological age, this is definitely a way forward for businesses. I think it's going to be quite hard for businesses to justify having individuals in their office 5 days a week.
Yeah, I think that must be right. We've actually had a question from somebody just asking our opinion on whether working at home is going to result in long-term cost savings to the services that are provided. I suppose potentially thinking about property costs that may or may not be needed. I don't know if any of you have a view on that. It's certainly something as a board, I think we're all going to, as boards, we're all going to have to think about what impact this has. Have you had any thoughts on that in terms of the economic impact?
So it's interesting because, you take the idea that there will be cost savings to the individual. Undoubtedly, people are spending less on commuting costs in the last few months. However, the other side of the coin to that is that the services that run rely on people paying for them. The Tube, for example, in London has taken a massive hit in terms of its how much revenue it's taking in each month. So if we go to a post-COVID world where fewer people are using these services, yes, it may be the fact that the services don't need to run as frequently, but the net effect is fairly unknown. Like, what's going to be the heavy effect of, running less services, but also at the same time less revenue?
Yeah. I think that's right. We've had a comment rather than a question as well, just saying that CIPD stats show that there have been less sickness being booked from those working from home than normal, and that's reflected in the company in which that individual works. And I think that is interesting. I think physical sickness, we're not out there quite rightly, part of the whole lockdown purpose, we're not out there able to catch these things. I wonder whether mental health eventually might start to increase, and we might see more absences from work as a result of that. But perhaps another question is just focusing on that sort of sickness element, but looking at the individual. I think we've all been impacted, haven't we, as individuals through this crisis? It's been just a really difficult time to live through for various different reasons, family reasons, homeschooling. I have become a teacher as well as a solicitor during this period. But CEBR and CEBR's done work, I know, showing the impact on things like savings, rate of employment, spend impact. Is there anything that you can share with us in terms of that individual impact?
Yeah, so I mean, just like you said, most of the stuff that's come out every day is just about what's happening on the economy, what's happening on the businesses. So it is interesting to actually see what's happening on the individual level. The rate at which people have been furloughed and pay cuts and working hours has obviously meant that on average, people's incomes have fallen. Actually, they've fallen by 17%, so quite a large decrease over this period. However, there is a net effect that actually is quite positive. Despite the fact that incomes have fallen 17%, they found that people, because they're not going out and spending their money on retail, the pub, or just commuting, anything along those lines, the net effect is that an average household is now saving an extra £280 per working month, which is quite significant because there's now this excess of savings that the UK economy just didn't really have before COVID. On the other side of that is that there's going to be a large unemployment impact. As it is, unemployment is rising, even with the furlough scheme being extended. And unemployment is now rising alongside falling vacancies options. The ability to get back into employment is becoming more challenging. At CEBR, we are actually expecting a 9% increase, unemployment to reach 9% by the end of this year, and take about 2 years to recover to where it was prior to the COVID lockdown.
Wow, that's amazing. I'm interested on the savings point. I think all of our savings have been taken by the kids eating more food constantly. I seem to be spending more and more and more on food, feeding lots of kids. Just having a quick look at a couple more questions. I think it'd be interesting. There's a question about the impact on the housing market, Daryn. I don't know if you've got views from a CEBR point of view on that.
Yeah, so we did model. Relatively at the beginning of the lockdown, we did some modelling exercise looking at the impact on the housing market. What we found was that we expect there to be 42% fewer transactions in house sales this year, which is very significant. This is also leading to the fact that we expect house prices on average through the UK to fall by 9%, which again is very significant. The other side of this, though, which is on a more recent kind of bit of analysis, we found that there's been quite a lot of pent-up demand during this lockdown period with people not being able to move houses. Within the rental field alone, we found that there's a 22% uptake in demand compared to the equivalent time last year. I suppose this basically comes from the inability of people to move over the last 3 months with them wanting to.
Yeah, I mean, we from a law firm point of view, we've had an interesting reaction to that. I mean, we kind of predicted from a revenue point of view just absolute shutdown, but we've seen activity stay there, sort of probably at a higher level than we envisaged, and coming back slowly. So I think that's just an interesting one. What the rental point is interesting, and I think you're probably right on as to why. There's a load more questions. I think we've got some time at the end. There was just a couple that were specifically on the report, and then we'll move on to Jim. Just a short question, Daryn. Which were the 4 sectors most affected from the Powerhouse Report findings?
So the 4 sectors that basically had the largest impact were, I suppose unsurprisingly as well, is the retail, which has been stripping out food retail, so non-essential retail, the hospitality sector, the housing market. Catching me off guard, I'm trying to think of the 4th one off my head now. I think it's probably manufacturing. I imagine so.
Yeah, I think it was. I mean, the sports and charity sectors were also hit, but I'm not sure they made the top 4, did they? I think sports and charity. I think the sports because of all the cancellation of events, and But
yeah, so it also depends if you're looking in absolute or relative terms, because I mean, in terms of relative terms, sport again is almost completely shut down, but they are a relatively smaller part of the economy compared to manufacturing and hospitality. So in absolute terms, a lot smaller of an impact.
Yeah. And then one more, perhaps I could leave you just to say a sort of yes or no answer, just conscious of time. There's a question about taking up of government loans and furlough. And is there any data that can actually point to whether there's been regional difference on how people have used furlough and shut down and those loans? Is there regional disparity on that? I suppose it might link to sector rather than region, but is there a short answer to that?
Typically, like ONS data releases annual figures and at a national level first before it releases any regional, and regional generally has quite a large time lag. So as far as I'm aware, there haven't been any data releases on regional uptakes of furlough schemes yet.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Daryn. That's a really useful insight, and the questions are still coming in. I'm not ignoring them. We will try and deal with those at the end. I've just tried to focus the ones on Daryn's, where I think they relate mostly to the report. I'm now going to hand over to Jim, who briefly introduced himself, and given it's been a good 25 minutes, Jim, reminder you're head of economic policy at regional policy, sorry, at the CBI. And Jim, if I just ask you just to give a short overview on the CBI, and then we'll go into some questions.
Sure. Thank you, Vicky. And yeah, so I'm head of regional policy. I wouldn't want to claim that I'm an economist like Daryn or some of my colleagues, but very happy to contribute to today's discussion. So I think if you look to what the CBI's work is guided by, that is the fact that productivity is the foundation of prosperity across the country. However, the UK has, of course, struggled to close its productivity gap with its international competitors and between and within its own regions. And rebuilding regional economies following the coronavirus pandemic and, in fact, preparing for Brexit poses unique challenges for England's regions in particular. So the regions that would be hardest hit by unemployment are the least resilient and most disadvantaged. For instance, in April, 2 million people filled in claims for universal credit, rising most in places like the North and the Midlands, going up about 3.5% in Blackpool and 3% in Liverpool and Hull. And, of course, my fear and others' fear is that this will, of course, get much worse in the weeks and months ahead. Though given the challenges we face, we believe that we need to supercharge the government's levelling up agenda, requiring sustained focus and attention. And of course, ensuring that the business voice is considered involves championing the importance of regional economies, shaping regional recovery plans, and influencing other government programs that will be considered in the weeks ahead.
That's a great introduction. Thank you, Jim. I think, obviously you have a vast membership that you can take soundings from all the time, and I know the CBI, my own interaction with them is really active in terms of engaging with its membership. What's the general mood on the ground in the UK from the CBI's perspective?
Well, Daryn touched quite nicely on some of the most impacted sectors, and I think that sort of certainly chimes with what we've heard from members directly. But the reality is it's facing everyone. There's real worry across all sectors and size of business, and many continue to work on damage control, facing how to begin reopening operations when it's safe to do so. And now there's broad acceptance that we're in a recession. That's the reality we face, and that sadly things will likely get worse and there will be wide-scale unemployment. There is certainly some concern and worry on policies such as the travel quarantine that was outlined by government yesterday in the House of Commons. But generally speaking, government interventions have been welcomed. So, more than 8 million people have been furloughed at a cost of £15 billion. And just last Friday, the Chancellor provided an update on more flexibility built into the system based on many of CBI's suggestions and recommendations, so that employers are able to pay staff for the hours work and can furlough for the rest, so that you can jump on and off the scheme as needed. But there are some trade-offs as well. So that scheme will close to new entrants from the 30th of June. Costs will begin to be shared from August, with the government contribution being slowly tapered down to 60% in October, and so on. And of course, the costs are being shared, beginning with employers paying NICs and pension contributions for the hours that employees do not work. But there's other support that has been welcomed as well. So, for instance, for the self-employed, more than 2 million claims have been made at a cost of nearly £7 billion as of last month. But despite questions remaining in the fine print, certainly, which the guest could certainly look to the expertise of Irwin Mitchell to help in that regard. Access to finance has steadily improved as well. So I don't know that there are regional figures, going back to a question that we've already received today, though more than £30 billion has been lent, including more than 20 billion lent via the bounce back loans to make it especially easy for SMEs to access finance, with I think over 80% of applications being approved, and nearly £9 billion for the coronavirus business interruption loan scheme, where more than 50% have been approved, and $1 billion for the large business interruption loans. So there's been a huge government effort, and government has been listening to the concerns of business over the past few weeks, and we sort of hope to continue to build upon that engagement moving forward. And sort of touching on some of the themes discussed already, there's also obviously some concern about employees' mental health, returning to work schemes. I guess the reality is that we face a multitude of challenges moving forward.
That's really comprehensive, Jim. Thank you. I mean, and I think that sense of worry and concern, I think we absolutely are seeing that reflected in our own business, that you've got, from a client perspective, you've got the gratitude almost of the business that the government has appeared to listen in the main and put the support in. And some of those figures, just phenomenal in terms of money that's been invested in this. But that real worry about how I do reopen, how I do get back to some kind of normal, and what is the recession going to do, I think people do see it getting worse before it gets better. So I think that the mood is, whilst there is hopefully some optimism in the end, at the moment I think it is feeling really challenging. And you touched in your intro, Jim, on the sort of productivity gap and the sort of levelling up agenda, and that's a focus for the CBI. Is that, Daryn touched on it in his, your view is that going to be even more difficult now because of the coronavirus?
Yes, probably so. I do think we should try our best under these incredibly daunting times to find the positive, such as the opportunity to make critical investments so that we can build back better. But to answer your question, the biggest challenge will be getting the right balance between putting people back into work and creating highly productive, good paying, fulfilling jobs for people. You could easily see this become an exercise of creating as many jobs as possible fast, which is of course important, but we shouldn't lose sight of the importance of closing the productivity gap by focusing on creating highly skilled jobs that will boost regions' productivity. So we believe we need bold, ambitious ideas that address immediate challenges and set up the country for the future. So focusing on jobs, technology and innovation and infrastructure that can deliver a sustainable, fairer future where every job rewards. Jobs are perhaps most important, but also the trickiest to get right. The reality is we have a very different labor market. So there's not just a skills mismatch, but now a challenge of just not enough jobs. And it's important to keep people engaged. So it's incredibly damaging if, for instance, someone is out of the labor market for 6 months plus. So, it won't be easy, but we must work to address productivity so that we achieve greater fairness, sustainability, and equality. Yeah.
So keeping the themes that we had pre-COVID alive is really important, but recognising that's all going to be done against the background of, as you say, getting people back to work and into employment, which will be a competing priority. And what next, do you think, from central government? What's the CBI hoping will come next from the central government?
Well, next month we anticipate, government setting out its strategy for the long-term recovery, and I think it's going to be focusing on those themes which I've mentioned a little earlier, of infrastructure, skills, and education, especially for young people who will be disproportionately affected, as well as investing in innovation, R&D, and technology for the future. So it's sort of, it seems like we've been in this new world for some time now, but the reality is, I think you've alluded to, it's been about sort of 3 months or so, and the pace of change in government action has been, tremendous at times, though there are concerns, outstanding concerns such as track and trace, how that might impact businesses as well as the quarantine and other matters.
Yeah, no, I understand that. And it's interesting just to, I mean, that's all leading, sort of bind into your theme of we've got to invest to make the country better and the economy better and to close that productivity gap. One of the questions that's actually come through on the feed, which I'll sort of leave into the end, but I think it sort of fits in here. We've seen historically government making a number of announcements about increasing the transport infrastructure, which is probably key to tackling some of the regional differences. But there's a question that comes in, is there still a business case for A2 if everyone's working remotely? So there's that tension, I suppose, if everyone's working at home, that the transport infrastructure investment isn't needed. But what sort of thing what sort of package do you recommend in terms of tackling those, to looking at the transport infrastructure and looking at that regional, trying to level it out between the different regions?
Well, infrastructure has always been critical to closing the regional divide, and that hasn't changed and will remain true in the months and years ahead. It's probably useful to think about infrastructure in the short and medium term and then the longer term. In the short, medium term, there's, as Daryn alluded to, there's been, major challenges to restarting the economy. Public transport is under huge pressure, given the loss of fare income, difficulty in social distancing. So we'll need to think of alternatives like staggered work times, which requires close collaboration between businesses and government, and doing more to promote walking and cycling, and continuing to invest in technology so that people are able to work remotely. And the long term, infrastructure absolutely fits to build no regrets actions to achieve net zero. So some possible ideas include major retrofit housing program, new Green Deal to promote energy efficiency, package on green infrastructure, measuring to accelerate how low carbon heat networks, electric vehicle charging networks, and low carbon infrastructure projects can be invested in. And of course, the ongoing commitment to large scale transport projects like HS2, Northern Powerhouse Rail, East-West Rail. Connectivity can pay dividends to improving regional productivity, and certainly the way people work will change, but ultimately people will need to get from point A to point B, and I suspect when we are safe to do so, people will be eager to get outside of their homes and begin interacting not only with their friends and family, but their colleagues in the future. So, in short, I think, certainly in the coming months, I predict government will be looking out for shovel-ready projects, and because it's a great way of putting people back to work, but it's also about making a long-term investment in the community.
Yeah, so it's about finding that connectivity where we can try and achieve both objectives. What do you think the role for the mayoral combined authorities and the local enterprise partnerships might be in all of this? Does it change post-COVID, or does it remain as it always was in terms of trying to level out this regional disparity?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. So government has made clear its ambition to increase the number of mayoral combined authorities. So there are currently 9 if you include London, and we'll be soon adding West Yorkshire, which has made some progress over the past year. And so actually the local elections scheduled for last month in May had been postponed to next year. So in next year we'll have 9 mayoral elections. And the mayors have been incredibly active in the COVID response. And have begun asking for additional powers, which of course are limited. But CBI members have welcomed their ability to lead, offer long-term economic visions, as well as attract investment from both Westminster and abroad, which will of course be especially important during the recovery effort. Given the government's view and their commitment to publishing a devolution white paper later this year, My view is that their powers will grow in some respects, but not be as fast as some would potentially like. So we've seen adult education budgets devolved over the past year. Clearly skills, as I said earlier, for younger people will be critically important in the future. On local enterprise partnerships, their future has been questioned since they've been formed 10 years ago now, and that hasn't really changed. The purpose was, of course, to bring together business and local government leaders, and partnership will remain critical. Though, I've shared in the past that some LEPs are stronger than others. The truth is that they have been working to adapt quickly under the challenging circumstances we find ourselves in. So by looking to work and analysis they've undertaken for local industrial strategies, for instance, and applying that to emerging regional recovery plans, that's an area of focus for the CBI in particular at the moment, is to continue engaging with LEPs, mayors on these regional recovery plans, because places will need to focus on their strengths. And the reality is that the task is too large for central government to take on alone. And as an example of that, if you look to the growth hubs across the 38 LEPs, they've been undertaking important work in providing business support to SMEs across England. If LEPs were to disappear, we need to replicate those vital services in some way.
Yeah. Okay. So still an important role, but I agree with you on the scepticism that's been applied in the past historically to the LEPs. But some of the regions we work in, we see some really good activity there, and that link with business is absolutely critical. So just as a final question for this section, and then we have got some more questions that are coming from the audience, which I think we will deal with before we wrap up. What does the CBI do next in this extraordinary time? And perhaps more importantly, we've got an enormous number of businesses sitting on this event, extraordinary number of people attending. How can they help?
Yeah, so at the CBI, we're continuing our work and thinking on building a new economic plan for the UK to move from restart to recovery. We're continuing to gather views on what is going to matter for the recovery plan and investments that will make a real difference. So this will, be a key focus of our ongoing member engagement. We'll also be considering what more can be done to kickstart recovery with some form of demand stimulus and push around competitiveness through improvements on regulation, planning, and procurement, for example. But we're also beginning to look at how we can revive regions. Building upon the landmark report you mentioned earlier, Vicky, of unlocking regional growth, where we worked alongside you and concluded that if we were to close the productivity gap, between regions themselves, so if we were to close the gap between places like Blackpool and Cheshire East and Northwest, and do the same across the country, that could equate to £200 billion being added to the economy over 10 years. This productivity gap affects how businesses grow, expand, and contribute. And it is a gap that has historically left areas outside London and the Southeast less able to bounce back from economic recessions. So we're considering how best to achieve a regional economic revival and renewal. And we'll consider how, following the pandemic, this will require more than a piecemeal approach. So success will require a bold and ambitious strategy that considers key drivers of productivity, regional funding, and where appropriate, devolved powers. And it will also require focus on delivering inclusive growth. We must build on the growing consensus that recovery requires us not going back to how things were. So this means asking some fundamental questions around the scale of the problem, understanding what most effectively drives regional productivity, what we mean by leveling up, and how we might hope to measure it, and ultimately how can we build back better.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, a really strong agenda, and I'd expect nothing less. And I think the relationship that the CBI has with the government, is a strong one and a very influential one. And I think then again with your members and taking the feedback from the members all the time, so you can see that relationship working really well. I think it's going to be really important as we come out of this. We're all really thinking hard about how we get on that road to recovery. So that's great, Jim. Thank you very much for all those really detailed answers. got probably 5 minutes just to take a few questions that have come through. What I'll do, guys, is I'll read the question. If you feel you can go for it, go for it. There's one here on retail, the retail sector, and the question there is about the fact that the retail world is offering increased discounts and cheaper sales. Do you think that's going to continue, or are we going to have to see those prices come back sort of more to a normal over time, or is that the way that they're going to have to continue for the foreseeable future to survive?
I'm not sure I caught all that, Vicky, but I mean, yeah, I mean, retail is under a huge amount of pressure. So obviously the supermarkets have, kept feeding the nation over the last couple months. Non-essential retail is beginning to look how it can reopen safely for its employees by the 15th of June. But there's no question that it was already facing challenges pre-COVID. Increasing demand for online shopping, where the UK leads the world in particular. So there are big questions facing the future of high streets, in addition to office space and the rest of sort of property moving forward. So there's no question that major challenges face them, and the also the reality is I think they employ more than 3 million people across the UK. So it sort of puts a fair number of people at risk as it continues to face these challenges. And there'll need to be a major focus on how we can retrain and redeploy these people in the future.
Thank you, Jim. Daryn, there's a couple on hospitality, entertainment. I think just really about the sentiment, people going back. We were talking about this actually just before we came on the event, and predicting, is there any sort of economic analysis gone into the fact? I suppose it's just a complete uncertainty about, are we testing what people's intentions are going to be post lockdown? There's a specific question on that, particularly going into pubs and restaurants again and how confident they feel, but there's also a specific question around the entertainment industry and people wanting to go back into theatres and how that might come back. Is there any thought been given by either of you, but to that sort of impact and how we measure that and try and assess that and forecast that?
So from my point of view, I actually think it may take a while until people are willing to go back into crowded spaces, the pubs, theatres, restaurants and all that, out of fear of causing a second spike or catching the virus if they've not had it. However, the point to note is that there is this excess of savings. People have pent up money saved back, and they've had months now of not being able to do any typical entertainment type of spending. It wouldn't be unrealistic to almost expect, once it's safe to go back to these places, that there may be a more than return to normal spending boost from people basically spending the previous 3 months kind of pent up on the entertainment sector.
Having a big blowout, big party.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm sure that could happen. Jim, probably one for you, just on the export market, actually, large part of the future economy. Any thoughts specifically on that export market and its part going forward?
Yeah, I think it will be a crucial part. And if you look to the role of mayors in particular, that's something where, certainly Andy Street and Andy Burnham have focused some of their attention, using some of their soft power to deploy internationally, to not only attract inward investment, but also to sort of promote the regions at large, so that we're able to sort of build upon their profile. And so, yeah, certainly free ports has been suggested by the government. They've sort of delayed their consultation, but have said they want to commit to building or approving 10 free ports across the country. Certainly, as we're sort of responding to the twin impacts of coronavirus and the reality that we're leaving the EU, we'll need to build upon supply chains and find efficiencies so that we are able to find those export opportunities for the future. We did find within the Unlocking Regional Growth Report that we worked with you on that exports is a key driver of productivity, because it oftentimes leads to increased innovation as well, which is important to remember.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I think a last one, just conscious of time, there are some others, but just picking this one out, just interesting. I think probably Jim, for you, do you think there is a chance of some sort of geographical rebalance if service industry professionals move from the southeast for lifestyle reasons, because suddenly location of where we're working doesn't matter as much anymore? Do you think that will have an impact?
Quite possibly. Yeah, it's a good question.
It's a great question, isn't it?
We've found that at the CBI itself. So I'm based in London, but my team is based across the country in our regional offices, which is slightly different to how we've managed our policy work in the past. And already there have been questions asked amongst employees whether there might be further opportunities for just that. If you look to sort of a breakdown of sectors across the regions, it's actually not as different as people might imagine. But what the big difference seems to be is the type of role within those particular sectors. So, you know, some of the more highly skilled or highly paid jobs tend to be focused in the southeast. But as people look to, you know, their work-life balance, potentially working remotely, maybe coming into the office once or twice a week opposed to 5 days a week. Yeah, I think it could very well begin to have an impact.
Yeah.
If I could add, sorry, can I add?
Yeah, sorry, Daryn.
Yes. So at CBR, we did back in November time, we did a piece of research with Openreach that looked at precisely this. It looked at what would happen if the UK basically rebalanced all its Wi-Fi speeds throughout the country. What would happen to these urban clusters? Would people move out? And it found that throughout the UK, so Manchester, Leeds, Birmingham, London, it found that when all the rural regions were forecast to or predicted to have better Wi-Fi speeds, so the cost of digital commuting fell, that the populations leaving London and leaving these metropolitan areas increased quite significantly.
Yeah, I think that will be a really interesting dynamic. I mean, a bit like you, Jim, we've got people who would normally be London based, but have, you know, gone out to, you know, the home counties predominantly, so still southeast, but they are not working in London. And I think there's been some appeal to some of that. And I think moving further afield, perhaps to join family or friends, I think that could be really interesting. And there's a nice stat that's coming actually from one of the audience that said that a survey within the organisation, they had 4% working from home prior to COVID, and 92% would now like to work from home more than 1 day a week in the future. It's a tech company in Leeds, 175 employees. You know, it's just that whole sentiment. I think, you know, just ending the Q&A on there, and thanks, guys, it's been really, really informative. I hope the audience have found that as well. But I think just moving into that slightly more positive, because there are some positives that will come out of this, and I think people have seen some of the positives in that work-life balance arena. Can I ask each of you just to perhaps sum up in a short minute or less, some of, you know, what you think maybe the positives might be out of all of this going forward? Daryn, do you want to go first?
Yeah, happy to. One way to look at it is really not all doom and gloom. Although the UK is predicted to lose about a third of its economy per day, third of output in the economy per day, another way to spin it really is that despite the most draconian measures and a pandemic that's happening, the UK is still producing 2/3 of its total output. This is quite resilient given what actually is happening throughout the UK and throughout the world. It's just with the ability to work from home and the frontline sectors still finding ways to operate, it's potential that this output would be much lower had it been 10 years lower when technology wasn't able to facilitate this.
Yeah, no, I agree. Keeping that 2/3 number in mind is yeah, that's always definitely a nicer way to look at it, even though absolutely, as you say, a third of it is really significantly gone away, and hopefully not for good. Jim, do you want to give your thoughts just briefly on the opportunities that you can see?
Yeah, I mean, from the CBI's perspective, we are totally focused on how we can build back better. So we believe that we need to take this opportunity to outline a vision for our future based on fairness, equality, and sustainability. So, you know, firstly, we should look to our infrastructure pipeline, you know, ensuring sustainability, focusing on renewables and insulating homes. Secondly, training. So government and business need to help retrain and reskill people taking regional needs into account. And then lastly, digital innovation. We've already seen what can be done or achieved through better connectivity, so we need to build on that. The key challenge, of course, is that innovation costs money, and many firms still are in survival mode, but the CBI is looking at policy solutions, so scaling up grants or R&D tax credit support, calling on the government to explore incentives for companies to boost their productivity as a key part of the recovery. The good news is that many are beginning to realize that innovation can lead to resilience, and we know that the government is in the market for practical, actionable ideas, which we are heavily engaged and involved with. So please do get in touch if you'd like to become involved in that moving forward.
That's great, thank you. And I'll just end, if I may, by certainly thanking both Daryn and Jim. Been really informative. I think we could have probably got on for quite a while. I'd be interested on feedback from the audience, whether sort of updates on this going forward might be useful. It's certainly been a really good insight at at a sort of practical level from my perspective. Thank you to everyone who's joined our event. I think the takeaways from me are probably not that surprising, in the sense that I think this is obviously a time of unprecedented change that we're all living through, but just going back to the positives, that build back better message from the CBI, I think, is really a great way of summing that up. I think what we have seen, as well as all the really nice human things around kindness, people just being more tolerant of each other and actually understanding people and listening a lot harder. I think we have seen that entrepreneur spirit. We have seen that innovation that's come through from businesses that are finding new ways to survive. The government support has helped with all of that, of course. And this sounds like there's lots of policies coming from the CBI and similar bodies to really help the workforce to adapt. And I think the challenge for us as employers is to capture all of those new skills, to capture this kind of confidence that we can change, and to take that into the new normal and do the very best that we can. So I think definitely some absolute shoots for positivity and optimism. So thank you both very much. It's been an absolute pleasure spending the last 6 minutes with you. Thank you to everyone who's joined us. We have had questions about a little bit on all the furlough arrangements. I'm definitely not an employment expert designed to help that, but there are other events that we are hosting which go specifically to all of the furlough. And I know that legislation is very complicated, so if people want details of that, please do get in touch with us. But thank you very much for joining, and hope to see you all soon. Thank you.